On June 18, 1815, near a quiet Belgian village called Waterloo, one man gambled everything he had left. Napoleon Bonaparte, once master of Europe, conqueror of empires, terror of kings, was fighting his final battle. By nightfall, his army would be shattered, his legend sealed, and his fate irreversible. This is the story of how Napoleon returned from exile, fought one last campaign, and lost it all at Waterloo. In 1814, Napoleon had already lost. After years of brutal continent-spanning wars, the combined forces of Europe finally defeated him and sent him into a humiliating exile on the small island of Elba, just off the coast of Italy. They thought he was finished, but Napoleon wasn't just any man, he was a force of nature. In February 1815, in a move of breathtaking audacity, he escaped Elba with a handful of followers and landed back in France. What happened next was astonishing. The soldiers sent to arrest him didn't fire a shot. Instead, they tearfully pledged their allegiance and joined his march. King Louis XVIII, the monarch restored by the Allies, fled Paris in terror. Within weeks, Napoleon reclaimed his throne and his empire without spilling a single drop of blood. Europe was thrown into a state of panic. The great powers Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia had been busy redrawing the map of Europe at the Congress of Vienna. They immediately stopped their bickering, declared Napoleon an outlaw, and formed a new, seventh coalition. Their goal was singular and absolute. Napoleon had to be destroyed, this time permanently. Knowing he was outnumbered and that time was against him, Napoleon decided to do what he did best: strike first, fast, and hard. Napoleon's strategy was a classic masterpiece of military genius, designed to exploit the divisions among his enemies. Two massive coalition armies were gathering in Belgium. The first was an Anglo-allied force under the command of the brilliant but cautious Duke of Wellington. The second was a hardened Prussian army led by the fiery old warrior, General Blucher. Napoleon's plan was to drive a wedge between them, defeat them separately, and prevent them from ever uniting on the battlefield. At first, the plan worked with surgical precision. On June 16th, Napoleon engaged the Prussians at the Battle of Ligny and gave them a severe beating. At the same time, his trusted Marshal, Ney, engaged Wellington's forces at the crossroads of Quatre Bras. Ney managed to hold Wellington in place but failed to deliver a decisive blow. Following their respective battles, both enemy armies retreated. Napoleon believed victory was within his grasp. He dispatched a third of his army under Marshal Grouchy with a simple, critical order: pursue the defeated Prussians and make sure they couldn't link up with Wellington. It was a logical move, but it was based on a fatal assumption that the Prussians were retreating away from the main theater of war. That assumption, that single miscalculation, would cost him everything. The battlefield of Waterloo was not some dramatic, epic landscape. It was just rolling farmland, muddy fields, and a low ridge south of the village. It was here that Wellington chose to make his stand. He was a master of defensive warfare, and he positioned his army brilliantly. He hid the bulk of his troops on the reverse slope of the ridge, protecting them from the devastating power of Napoleon's famous artillery. Napoleon himself arrived late on the scene. The night of June 17th had brought torrential rain, turning the entire area into a quagmire of thick, sticky mud. This was a disaster for Napoleon. He relied on his cannons, and they couldn't be maneuvered or fire effectively in such conditions. He made the fateful decision to delay his attack until late morning, around 11:30 a.m., to allow the ground to dry. Every hour he waited was an hour Wellington's defenses grew stronger. More importantly, every hour he waited was an hour the Prussians, under Blucher, had to march toward the sound of the guns. Napoleon either didn't know they were coming, or in his supreme self-confidence, he simply didn't believe they could arrive in time to make a difference. That delay would prove to be one of the most critical errors of his entire career. The battle finally opened with a thunderous artillery barrage from Napoleon's Grand Battery, followed by an infantry attack on a fortified farmhouse on Wellington's right flank, known as Hougoumont. This attack was meant to be a diversion to draw Wellington's reserves away from the center where Napoleon planned his main assault. Instead, Hougoumont became a battle within the battle, a bloody vortex that sucked in thousands of French soldiers. They attacked again and again, with incredible bravery, but the small contingent of British and German defenders held on with grim determination, refusing to break. Napoleon wasted precious troops and time on a position that never fell and had little strategic value. Next came the main French infantry assault against Wellington's center. Massive columns of French soldiers marched uphill, drums beating, eagles flying high. But as they reached the crest of the ridge, Wellington's infantry, who had been lying down to avoid the cannon fire, suddenly stood up and unleashed devastating volleys of musket fire at point-blank range. The French columns faltered, then shattered. Then came Marshal Ney's fatal mistake. Seeing some British units pulling back, he mistook it for a general retreat. Without orders, he launched one of the largest cavalry charges in history. Thousands of French cuirassiers thundered across the valley. But Wellington's men were ready. They formed defensive infantry squares, bristling with bayonets. The cavalry swirled around them, unable to break in. Charge after futile charge was repulsed. Napoleon watched in horror as his elite cavalry, the pride of his army, was systematically destroyed against the unbreakable British squares. By mid-afternoon, a new sound began to echo from the east, the sound of distant gunfire. Napoleon's worst fear was becoming a reality. The Prussians had arrived. Against all odds, the 72-year-old Blucher, after being defeated just 2 days earlier, had rallied his men and force-marched them across the muddy countryside to aid his British ally. His vanguard began attacking Napoleon's right flank near the village of Plancenoit. This was the turning point of the battle. Napoleon was now forced to divert precious troops, including units of his elite young guard, to hold off this new threat. He was now fighting on two fronts, caught in a pincer, the very situation his entire campaign was designed to avoid. The pressure was immense. Wellington's line was bending, but it was not breaking. On the right, the Prussians were pushing relentlessly. Napoleon's army was being stretched to its absolute limit. Time, which he had so carelessly wasted in the morning, was now his greatest enemy. The window for victory was rapidly closing. As evening approached, with the sun beginning to set over the blood-soaked fields, Napoleon knew he had one last card to play. He committed the Imperial Guard, his final reserve, the most elite and feared soldiers in all of Europe. They were his legends, his invincibles, the men who had secured victory for him on a dozen battlefields. They had never known defeat. They advanced in a final, desperate assault on Wellington's battered center, a last-ditch effort to shatter the British line before the Prussians could overwhelm them completely. The Guard marched forward with grim determination, attired in blue coats and towering bearskin hats, straight into the heart of the Allied position. For a terrifying moment, it looked like they might succeed. They pushed back the British frontline troops. Then, Wellington gave his famous order. His own elite foot guards, who had been hiding behind the ridge, stood up and unleashed a devastating volley. The Imperial Guard, the unconquerable, hesitated. They wavered, and then, for the first time in their glorious history, they broke and fell back. The cry, a sound of pure disbelief and horror, rippled across the battlefield. Le Garde is defeated. The psychological impact was catastrophic. French morale, which had been stretched to the breaking point all day, instantly collapsed. The moment the Guard retreated, Wellington, sensing the decisive moment, rose in his stirrups and waved his hat forward, signaling a general advance. Along the entire front, the battered but resilient Allied line surged forward. At the same time, the Prussians, having finally captured Plancenoit, crashed into Napoleon's flank, completing the encirclement. What was a battle now became a rout. Napoleon's army disintegrated into a chaotic mob of fleeing men. Command and control vanished. Units dissolved. Men threw down their weapons and ran for their lives, pursued relentlessly by Prussian cavalry throughout the night. By nightfall, the battlefield was a scene of unimaginable carnage. The fighting was over. Napoleon had lost roughly 25,000 men killed or wounded, with thousands more captured. The Grande Armée was no more. His 100-day gamble and his empire was finished. Within days, Napoleon reached Paris, a defeated emperor. He abdicated his throne for the second and final time. This time there would be no escape, no triumphant return. The British, taking no chances, exiled him to the remote, windswept island of St. Helena in the desolate South Atlantic, thousands of miles from anywhere. It was there, a prisoner on a rock, that he would live out his final years, dictating his memoirs and crafting his own legend before his death in 1821. Waterloo wasn't just a battle, it was the end of an era. It marked the definitive end of the Napoleonic Wars that had ravaged Europe for over a decade. It was the final defeat of revolutionary France and the triumph of the old monarchies fighting together in a coalition. The battle reshaped the political map of Europe for the next century, ushering in a period of relative peace but also of conservative reaction. At Waterloo, Napoleon Bonaparte didn't just lose a battle or a war. He lost history's last and greatest chance to bend the entire continent of Europe to the will of a single man. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more epic history.